All right, well, welcome to the next lecture in environmental toxicology at IPEC-EDU. Today's topic is endocrine disruptors. Before I get started, I just want to say that nothing about what I'm going to teach you in any way is off with any judgment with respect to sexual orientation, gender identification, personal biology, and I do not intend to and will not make any social comments on the diversity of phenotypes that exists in the expression of biological gender in people in the United States, around the world. And so this is just an objective review about what's happening and what the science says is happening, as all of our lectures are, and some motivational speech about how to change this. So the first thing I want to say is endocrine system is fascinating, and it involves organs distributed throughout the body. They are responsible for sending and receiving hormonal signals by and large. Some of them are involved in digestion. Some of them are involved in our immune system. Some of them are involved in our reproduction. Some of them are involved in controlling our autonomous systems. And what I want to point out to you that is, if you haven't had my biology course, that I did do a lecture on hormones in the endocrine system. And if you want to review that, if it helps you understand this material better, if you haven't had that course, I'm giving you access to that lecture here on Vimeo with this password, IPEC-BioB 2021. I would encourage you to use that if you haven't had the course on biology from me. And of course, I would encourage you to take that course in biology as well. So let's talk about what are endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's a typo there, chemicals. EDCs are chemicals that mimic, block, or interfere with the production, action, or interactions of hormones. So the chemicals from outside the body. They can come in the form of toxins in the environment. They can be drugs that you take. They could be surfaces on your pizza boxes, linings of your canned food. They can be additives in food. They can be things that are sprayed on plants that become food, and things that animals eat and become food. They can originate from people dumping their hormone pills, like birth control pills, down the toilet. It can go into the water cycle. There's over 5 billion tons of EDCs that are produced each year worldwide. Their actions on the human body: they can alter normal fetal development in ways that can alter or impair sexual function. They can impair metabolic functions, and they can increase the risk of certain cancer types. The estimated disease burden in the European Union due to endocrine disrupting chemicals is 340 billion euros. Children and individuals with impaired immune systems are most impacted. The routes of exposure of EDCs include ingestion of food and water, whether it's well water or water that's been treated at a water treatment plant. The treatments at the water treatment plant do not remove endocrine disrupting chemicals. They can occur, the exposure can occur to the fetus in utero during pregnancy, gestation. You could absorb some through the skin, as in cosmetics. They will be carried into your body if you breathe dust, so it's important that you dust your house on a regular basis. The risks can include, again, reproductive impairment, cognitive deficits, metabolic disorders and diseases, and certain cancers. And there's a consensus on the key characteristics of EDCs as a basis for hazard identification that I'll refer you to there at nature.com. Some of the specific findings of studies, more specific findings of individual studies and collections of studies, are that exposure to pesticides like DDT can increase the risk of cardiovascular disease and inflammation in women who are premenopausal. So Exposure to BPA, bisphenol A, has been linked to an increase in infertility, cancer, and metabolic disorders, including diabetes. Exposure to BPA during pregnancy may increase the offspring's risk of developing diabetes or cardiovascular disease later in life. Early onset of menopause has been linked to 15 chemicals, including phthalates and PCBs. PCBs can interfere with thyroid hormone action in pregnant women, which may affect brain development in fetuses. Men, women, and children exposed to high levels of phthalates may have reduced level of testosterone. So this low T syndrome that we hear about in men and women that have lost their sex drive, that test low for testosterone, they may have a problem producing testosterone due to exposures to phthalates. Exposure to EDCs have been estimated to cost between 100 to 260 billion euros per year in the European Union due to contributing to a number of diseases and health conditions. And the resource here is endocrineweb.com for professionals, health effective environmental disruptors. Great website. Frequent sources of EDCs, pesticides on food, like I said, hormones in drinking water, groundwater near point sources, especially factories that produce particular chemicals as the product that they should then ship out for manufacturing. Soy food products, plastic containers, thermal paper printed receipts from the restaurant, household chemicals, fabrics treated with flame retardants, cosmetics, lotions, products with fragrance, and antibacterial soaps. There's a huge diversity in EDCs. There's thousands of chemicals that qualify as endocrine disrupting chemicals. We literally have no idea what the full biological effect of all the chemicals that we've produced through the chemistry driven ecosystem, I want to say, of products that are out there. These chemicals are profoundly diverse in their structure and function and their effects. They're not uniform at all. Even within phthalates, there's a diversity of types of phthalates, and the European members agreed to restrict 4 of them, but there's thousands more. In terms of sources and where they're likely to specific sources of some of the more common EDCs, like DDT, chlorpyrifos, which has just been banned in the United States, atrazine, which has been shown in studies to bias the gender distribution in frogs, 2,4-D, glyphosate. The sources are those are pesticides and herbicides. Children's products often have lead, phthalates, cadmium, so you want to be sure to watch out for those. Cadmiums, an EDC. Industrial solvents, lubricants, plastics, and food storage containers can have phenol, phthalates, and bisphenol A, especially. Brominated flame retardants, PCBs, those are usually found in electronics and building material. Phthalates, parabens, and UV filters, those can be found in personal care products, medical tubing, and sunscreens. Triclosan, antibacterial soap and toothpaste, and perfluorochemicals, textiles, clothing, non-stick food wrappers, microwave popcorn bags, and non-stick cookware. So you want to avoid microwave popcorn. The U.S. National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences tells us that bisphenol A is used to make polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins, which are found in many plastic products, including food storage containers. You do not want to put or serve food or heat food in plastic. That's not bisphenol A free. Dioxins, they're produced as a byproduct of herbicide production. And paper bleaching, they're carcinogens. They are released in the environment during waste burning and wildfires. So dioxins are a known carcinogen as well as an endocrine disruptor. Perchlorate, it's a byproduct of the aerospace, weapon, and pharma industries found in drinking water and fireworks. Perfluoroalkyl or polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, used widely in industrial applications, firefighting foams, nonstick pan, paper, and textile coatings. These are the forever chemicals, right? So that's a good example of a point source type of pollution, such as the DuPont plant that Mark Ruffalo covered in his movie, Dark Waters. Phthalates are used to make plastics more flexible, so they're plasticizers. They're also found in some food packaging, cosmetics, children's toys, and medical devices. Phytoestrogens, these are plant products that are present naturally in some plants. They have hormone-like activity, such as genistein and daidzein, that are soy products. They're powerful, so powerful that the estrogen-like effects of phytoestrogen can have profound effect on both male and female biology, like tofu and soy milk. Polybrominated diphenyl esters, or PDBEs, they're the flame retardants for household products like furniture, foam, and carpets, and polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. They're found in electrical equipment, transformers, hydraulic fluids, heat transfer fluids, lubricants, and plasticizers. So PCBs could be found in the ballasts of lights, the fluorescent lights in schools, and some old schools. There's been leaks that have occurred, and there's been developmental disorders in the children, problems with development as a result of exposure to these PCBs. Triclosan, as I mentioned, they can be found in antimicrobial personal care products like the body wash and toothpaste. So you want to avoid that. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but there's a breakdown here when I send you these slides. You can read more about them as their types, but very well known. So what are the effects? So you have hormone mimics. So these are ADCs that have the same effect as a hormone. You can have hormone agonists that actually work against the hormone, so they have the opposite effect of a hormone, but they don't actually interact with the hormone, where it's receptor. Where you can have hormone antagonists, which actually interferes with the hormone. Right. So there's three different biological effects. For example, phthalates are androgen disruptors, and they can cause male genitalia to be smaller and tend to resemble female genitalia. This is known as phthalate syndrome in the research literature in rats that are exposed to phthalates. I'm just going to read you an example here of a study that described what happens. So several animal studies report that chemicals, okay, DBP, DEHP, and BZBP induce a marked reduction in fetal testosterone produced by the Leydig cells and insulin-like growth factor 3, resulting in a syndrome of male reproductive anomalies, which, in addition to shortened AGD, includes hypospadia, cryptorchidism, and malformations of the epididymis, vas deferens, seminal vesicles, and prostate. So I'm going to tell you what some of those things are. So the hypospadias and cryptorchidism. So cryptorchidism would be hidden genitalia. They're there, but they're not exposed to the outside. Hypospadia is underdevelopment of the male reproductive genitalia, and the severity of the displacement, the closure of the midline actually is determined by the dose and the timing. So you can have malformations that include failure of closure of the midline all the way up to the glandular region or the coronal region, the distal penile region, the midshaft, and so on, all the way down. So these individuals are born with genitalia that don't resemble typical male genitalia, and it can be traced back to exposures to the phthalates, specifically with this action of reduced fetal testosterone availability. I think this is the reference. Yeah, well, this is a good reference anyway in environmental research. Environmental phthalate exposure in relation to reproductive outcomes and other health endpoints. This is a good overview. It's very technical. There's lots and lots of studies that are talked about, and all the associations. Right? This is published in 2009. So this has been known for some time. That they have this table in here that shows reproductive and immune, metabolic, and thyroid. And the specific effects on males include sperm DNA damage, decreased sperm motility, decreased sperm morphology, decreased sperm concentration, decreased free testosterone, decreased follicular stimulating hormone, decreased motility, decreased pulmonary function, increased waist circumference, increased insulin resistance in thyroid, decrease from T3 to T4. I would encourage you to understand that the phthalates have multiple effects because there's so many of them, but also because the very powerful effect, kind of across the board powerful effect of testosterone during development. This particular review includes the description of aggregates of fetal Leydig cells in the developing testes. So there's a malformation of development of hormone-producing cells, testosterone, the Leydig cells. The morphologic changes were preceded by a decrease in fetal testicular production by the androgen testosterone, which reached only 10% of the control concentration in some animals. So these actually stop the proper development of these cells which produce testosterone. So they're an antagonist. They're blocking the production. So when we think about the effects of chronic exposure, during development, during toddlerhood, during childhood, young adult, and adult, we need our endocrine system throughout our lives, right? So endocrine disrupting chemicals include reproductive problems, lung and liver degeneration, liver cancer, insulin production problems, as we've seen, type 2 diabetes risk, hippocampal plasticity in the brain, problems with the hippocampus. That's actually important for memory, long-term memory. Endometriosis, gut microbiota, gynecomastia in males, and premature puberty, premature secondary sexual characteristics in females. Okay. So there's reduction in fertility and alteration of ovarian function with chronic di-n-butyl phthalate exposure. This is a study I picked out of many studies, just like this. The acute toxicity exposure include for short-term effects, impaired male sperm function, impaired follicular function. In females, oxidative stress genes are overexpressed, DNA strand breaks are observed, and this is troubling because the NIEIH says even low doses of endocrine disrupting chemicals may be unsafe. The body's normal endocrine functioning involves very small changes in hormone levels. Yet we know even these small changes can cause significant developmental and biological effects, which brings up low-dose toxicity, and this has been studied. There are direct and translational effects of low doses of exposure of DEHP phthalate on social behaviors of mice. And so whether they tend to aggregate with each other, do they associate with each other during, in the brood, how do the adults relate to each other? Those are all impacted, even at very low doses. Now, there's some good news here, right? Good news here is that the consumer choice, right? These aren't mandated products. There's kind of a default mandate that if it's in the environment and it's polluted, that you have to breathe air, you have to drink water. But through your consumption patterns and your consumption choices, you can have a great effect on this. So this is a fascinating study that I found called the Hermosa study. And it's a study of 100 Latino teenage young women, some that they measured them at baseline. And then they said, okay, for the next 3 months, choose products that don't contain EDCs. And this is for the cosmetics, this is for their skin lotions, this is for all of the products that they use over the course of their days, weeks, and months. And watch what happens. So they measured phthalates, parabens, triclosan, and oxybenzone before and after the intervention. So this is what's called the before and after study design. The intervention included stopping use of contaminated cosmetics and other personal care products for 3 days. That wasn't 3 months, it was for 3 days, just 3 days. Okay, the title is Reducing Phthalate, Paraben, and Phenol Exposure from Personal Care Products in Adolescent Girls. Findings from the Hermosa intervention study. This is on the University of California, Berkeley. And look at what they found. Phthalates were down 28%. Oxybenzone down 35%. Triclosan down 36%. Parabens down 44%. They were still there, but these were massive and significant decreases just on the choice of one aspect of the lives just for 3 days. Right? So there's the link to the Hermosa study at Berkeley, really super study. Here's an article that from Environmental Health News that explains that endocrine disruptive chemicals can weaken our battle against COVID because the effects of the hormone disruption are so powerful. I'm not sure if they had science behind that or not, but we want to be able to do well against infections, and the last thing we need is to be more susceptible to serious COVID-19 on the basis of problems with our immune system. Well, it makes sense. The thyroid is so important in our immune system that if you have a thyroid disruption, that you might not be able to actually tell self from non-self and regulate other parts of the body, things like that. The parathyroid, I should say, is where that occurs. So the association between bisphenol A exposure and risk in all-cause specific mortality in the U.S. This message from JAMA is that exposure to BPA, just one of the EDCs, is associated with a higher risk of death from all causes. The adjusted hazard ratio comparing the highest versus lowest tertile of urinary bisphenol A levels was 49% higher for all-cause mortality and was 46% higher, albeit not statistically significant, for cardiovascular disease mortality. All-cause mortality have a 50% increased risk if you have high bisphenol A levels. So this is really super important. They can contribute to stillbirths. This is a review in AJOG. So the ecosystem effects worldwide, right? The problems with these chemicals is that they can affect the development and biological functioning of algae, flowering plants, water fleas, daphnia, amphibians, fish, cows, sea lions. So in my survey of the literature, these are the animals that, well, if it's happening to fish and cows and sea lions, it's happening to every other mammal out there that's exposed to water near humans. If it's happening to algae and water fleas, that's an indication that there's a potential disruption of the food chain. And of course, we need our flowering plants for oxygen and for food. There's a message here in this paper. Are endocrine disruptors among the causes of deterioration of aquatic biodiversity? And there it is. You've got the food web being affected, biodiversity declining. If you're concerned about having a thriving ecosystem, you want to get rid of the EDCs produced everywhere because they go everywhere. Some of them last almost forever. So what I wanted to show you here is that there have been studies on these compounds in terms of the adverse event levels. So what type of exposure of these compounds typically produce the first adverse events. So you learned this in the concepts of toxicology lecture that I gave for the lowest observed adverse event level, for instance. So what Mao et al. Did in 2018 is they selected 3 well-known synthetic exogenous estrogen-like chemicals: bisphenol A, nonylphenol P, MP, nonylphenol, sorry, and diethylstilbestrol. And all 3 chemicals are known to be a major concern for animal and human health because they have estrogen-like effects, and there has been demonstrated human exposure. And they actually calculated through exposing animals the lowest observed adverse event level for each of the toxins. You know what that is because of the lecture on NOELs and LOLs. They found that BPA and nonylphenol have a greater than additive effect on the estrogenic effects. So there's an interaction between bisphenol A and nonylphenol, and that's kind of the point here, that they might look at the lowest observed adverse event level for individual toxins, as is required by the EPA and by the FDA, You have to do filings on your chemicals if you're producing a consumer product. But I'm writing an article right now pointing out that, for instance, in this example, there may be a problem with the estrogenic effects if they actually have an interaction where they help each other exaggerate the estrogenic effects or the loss of testosterone effects or whatever the effect is for any particular chemical. And these interactions, no one has any idea what to do about it. So it's been given lip service for 30 years, but no one actually has bothered to actually sit down and do a systematic analysis, both of the interactions between, toxins in the environment and toxins in food and toxins in pharmaceuticals and toxins in vaccines, right? So there's this diffuse kind of like externalization of liability that if my product does something because someone might interact with the product that I'm putting on my face for makeup, I'm not liable for that. And I think that that's incorrect. I think you share liability with the other company that also put out a compound that found its way to interact with you through normal human behavior, and so you share in that liability. I think most thinking people would agree with that position. The question is, well, what do we do about it? And what I'd like to see is a compound by compound study for pairwise low-Ls and adverse events, just like this one. Compound by compound of all the things that we're concerned about, so that we can tell people, well, listen, we know that you have to take this drug. Well, yes, we know you're going to be taking aluminum hydroxide because you're vaccinated, but you want to actually avoid this other thing over here. This is a very, very important development in kind of the awareness of what can potentially be done with objective science and the proper approach towards environmental science and public health. The clearance rates of environmental toxins of the EDCs. BPA is a good example, and it's an important lesson here because BPA breaks down into a conjugate form of BPA known as BPAG, and it's hydrolyzed by the body. And by hydrolysis, it actually changes into the effect that has a great endocrine disruption, right? So BPA by itself is not an endocrine disruptor. There's a modification that occurs in the body called hydrolysis. Well, it turns out that during pregnancy in sheep, there's a study that was done in sheep, that the BPA clearance in the mother sheep is slower than the fetus. So it seems like the mother's not processing the BPA. And the fetus actually hydrolyzes more because of the output from the mother fetus dyad in the urine above the metabolites that were studied actually showed, yes, this thing is being metabolized, but the actual serum concentrations in the mother didn't change that much over time. So the fetus is metabolizing BPA to BPAG more. And that's not a surprise because metabolic rates higher in the fetus. It's a small organism, but it's also doing an amazing number of hormonal things developmentally. So the metabolic fate of BPA and its conjugate is important for understanding dose toxicity and the toxical dynamics of BPA. This is that reference by Godera, and this is in July 2017. This is open access, and you can access that. So what does this mean? What this means is that if you're looking at an individual toxin and you don't look at its downstream biological conjugates or metabolites, and you don't measure for that metabolite separate from the original parental toxin, it's called, right? So BPA is the parental toxin, and the conjugate is BPAG, glucuronide, bisphenol A glucuronide. If you don't measure the downstream chemicals that are the product of the body interacting with the chemical, and that downstream chemical is the source of the toxic effect on the body, then you're not going to understand things like NOELs and LOELs. You just won't get it because it will look like, hey, this dose is the same as that dose. And there'll be a misattribution and the accumulation of metabolites that you're not measuring. You think that the BPA is not there, so your assay has to be very specific to understand what you're looking at. You have to look, as this study did, look at both, right? We've already seen this, but the population level exposures and costs in the European Union, hundreds of billions of euros per year. In the United States, our cost in terms of the externalized cost of the chemical industries and corporations that use those compounds and put them into our products are costing us up to 2% of our GDP every year in terms of health issues, right? So what can we do about it? What are the potential solutions? Well, number one is eat organic, eat organic, eat organic. By far the largest dose of exposure that you'll ever get for endocrine disrupting chemicals will be the food that you eat. Make sure the packaging doesn't have BPA. Pizza boxes can have BPA or other EDCs on them. The inside of cans, like I said, so you want to look at the can. If you have to buy canned food, if you're storing canned food, make sure that you look at it and it doesn't have any EDCs. You should have, if you live on your property, if you live on a property with a well, if you drink well water, you should have your well water tested both pre and post filtration if you use a filtration on your house or a softener on your house. You have to understand what's present in detail. This is a lifelong exposure. You should use an NSF certified water filter that will remove BPA. Because you should have your well waters tested pre and post filtration, because some people live so close to a point source and they don't know it. That even after filtration, it doesn't all come out. Right. So you want to avoid exposure, and by careful product selection, we saw that with our Hermosa study, just 3 days, 46% reduction. Amazing. Be extra careful in the months coming up to pregnancy, the years coming up to pregnancy, during pregnancy, and of course during childhood. That's where the exposures count the most. You should dust and vacuum your home frequently. You don't want to use plastics to store heats or soothe food or drinks. If you've had a bottle of water that you bought in the store and it's been in a heated car, you don't want to drink that. It's not a good idea. You want to avoid these canned foods, like I said, unless it's BPA and EDC free certified. And the other thing that you can do, and this is kind of a take home, is if you have a product and it's one of your favorite products and you learn that it contains BPA or any of these other endocrine disruptive chemicals, you can actually contact the company and ask them if they have an EDC free alternative or to produce that, and then encourage a ton of people that you know that like this product to contact the company and say, you know what, I'm going to drop your product because you're contributing to my chronic illness or potential my risk of chronic illness, and I don't want that. Although I love your product, I like your change. So this is kind of knocking them over with a feather. That's a good idea. Just talk to the people that run the companies and ask them to get rid of it. There was a documentary that I saw on Netflix of a man who had been producing canned foods all of his life, and when he realized that he had been one of the coatings on the inside of his can was probably bisphenol A, or it was one of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, and he had this major breakdown when he realized, and it was communicated to him by the public. Listen, I love your product, but I'm going to drop it. And he realized the negative impact that he could possibly have because they educated him on these issues. And so then he changed the coating in the factory of his cans. And he became an advocate for other companies to do the same thing. So it's highly effective to let them know what they're doing if they don't know it. You can all just run to the EPA or the FDA and we can make a file that this is a problem. We can make a big stink of it. But if we just talk with our fellow people and say, hey, there's a problem here, I'd like your product to do better. And then, yeah, that's a good personal experience. So in your challenge to accomplish one thing about this, contact the EPA and demand that they revisit the BPA ban. There's actually a stalemate on BPA. The Environmental Working Group has done a great job trying to hold EPA's feet to the fire. They did issue a ban on it, but it doesn't have any teeth and it's not being enforced whatsoever, right? So you can contact a company, like I said, with a popular EDC-containing product, start an online campaign, ask them to reduce or remove, and contact the environmentalworkinggroup.org and let them know you learned about their efforts in fighting with the EPA over the past decades to ban EPA, to ban BPA. And let them know that you heard from me. I want them to know that I'm out here promoting the organization. I don't have any affiliation with them. Here's some links to EPA if you want to read about endocrine disruption. The Wikipedia page on EDCs is actually quite good, and I recommend that you read it. It has the whole story on the EPA's dragging their feet. This is one of the things that no matter what walk of life you come from, no one wants to be at an increased risk of cancer and reduced reproductive capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So that's endocrine disruptors for today. I'll take questions.